What's the difference between these two answers? I like traveling. Traveling is relaxing. I travel every year. Traveling helps me learn about other cultures. Well, I really enjoy traveling because it helps me relax. For example, I often visit new cities during my holidays. On top of that, it's a great way to learn about different cultures. The difference between these answers is not vocabulary or grammar. The difference is something called discourse markers, and we're going to be speaking about them in this video. In fact, we're going to be looking at three things. First, what are discourse markers? Second, why is their flexible use important for Band 7? Finally, what are some of the most useful discourse markers you can use in IELTS speaking? To begin with, discourse markers is a big phrase that can be confusing. So, what are discourse markers? Here's a simple definition. Discourse markers are words or phrases that help organize speech and guide the listener through your ideas. For example, well, I think technology has both positive and negative effects on society. Exercise is good for physical health. Also, it can reduce stress. I enjoy living in the city, but sometimes it feels a bit too crowded. I like learning new skills. For example, I recently started learning how to cook. Discourse markers are important because they increase your coherence. That means they are helping your listeners follow your ideas more easily. When I was working as an IELTS examiner, I often noticed that students stuck at Band 6 had good vocabulary and grammar, but their ideas sounded disconnected. Learning to use discourse markers naturally can make your answers sound much more fluent. There's another reason that discourse markers are important. To score a Band 7 or higher, you need to use them flexibly in your answer. For example, Band 7 for fluency and coherence requires a flexible use of spoken discourse markers, connectives, and cohesive features. Band 8 requires answers that are coherent, appropriate, and relevant. And Band 9 answers are fully coherent and appropriately extended. All of this means that if you want a high score on IELTS speaking, you need variety. Low-scoring students will repeat the same discourse markers again and again and again. I like to read. Also, I like fiction books. Also, I like reading magazines. Do not repeat the same marker. You need natural use. When you're using discourse markers, you have to be using them where they naturally occur in speech. You shouldn't be saying, I use, for example, social media to check in with my friends. A lot of discourse markers belong at the beginning of the sentence. For example, I use social media to check in with my friends. You need to not sound memorized. You never want to sound mechanical or like you've memorized things on the IELTS test. The test is a conversation, and not just you robotically reciting previously memorized language. An example of a mechanical use of discourse markers is to structure every answer around firstly, secondly, moreover. It's just not natural speech. Instead, you can mix it up with more natural sounding markers, like well, for example, also. It's also important to keep in mind that IELTS examiners are listening for natural communication and not memorized connectors. Now, before we get into some discourse markers that you can use, I want to make a very important clarification. The advice I'm giving to you right now is meant to be applied to the IELTS speaking test. Writing is different. How? Well, in writing, our discourse markers are usually much more formal than the discourse markers we use in speaking. For example, writing connectors are words like moreover, furthermore, consequently, nevertheless. Spoken discourse markers, on the other hand, tend to be shorter and more informal. Words like well, actually, also, but, so, and for example. Now, it's not that using more formal discourse markers is wrong when you're speaking. Sometimes I would use them, but they are inappropriate on the IELTS test and can make you sound a bit silly and a bit mechanical. So remember, writing uses formal connectors. Speaking uses more conversational discourse markers. Now that you understand why discourse markers are important, let's look at some that you can actually use on the IELTS speaking test. We're going to look at 6 different categories of discourse markers: starting your answer, adding information, contrasting ideas, explaining a cause or a result, giving examples, and organizing ideas. So let's look at each one. First, some discourse markers are great when starting your answer. These markers help you begin speaking naturally, and they're especially useful when the examiner asks a question and you need a moment to organize your thoughts. Well is often used to start an answer or soften a response. For example, well, I usually spend my weekends relaxing at home or meeting friends for coffee. Actually is used to correct or clarify an idea, or introduce a slightly different perspective. For example, if you're asked if you like to study in the morning, you may respond, actually, I prefer studying in the evening because it's usually quiet and I can concentrate better. To be honest is used to express a personal opinion honestly or directly, and it may also be used to say something that you're a little embarrassed or hesitant to share. For example, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of crowded shopping malls because they can be quite stressful. I suppose is used when the speaker is thinking out loud or giving a tentative opinion. Maybe the speaker is unsure. For example, I suppose technology has made communication easier, although it can sometimes reduce face-to-face interaction. Next are markers we can use when adding information. These markers help you expand your answer with additional ideas, which is important for developing responses in IELTS speaking, especially in Part 3. Also is the most common and natural way to add another idea. I enjoy traveling because it allows me to explore new places. Also, it's a great opportunity to learn about different cultures. Now, yes, I know that also is a really common discourse marker, but sometimes it's the best word you can use. Besides can be used to introduce an additional supporting reason. For example, I enjoy reading books because they help me relax. Besides, they allow me to learn new things. Another reason is useful for clearly adding a second explanation. For example, I enjoy exercising regularly for my health. Another reason is that it helps reduce stress after a long day. On top of that, emphasizes an extra benefit or point. For example, public transportation is convenient because it's affordable. On top of that, it helps reduce traffic congestion. Now, here are some discourse markers we can use for contrasting ideas. But is the most common and natural way to introduce contrast in English. For example, I enjoy living in a big city, but sometimes the traffic can be quite frustrating. Again, yes, it's very common, but don't be afraid to use it. It's very natural. We also have, however, which is slightly more formal, but still quite common. For example, online learning is very convenient. However, some students may miss the interaction of traditional classrooms. The discourse marker, on the other hand, is used to present an alternative viewpoint or perspective. Here's an example. Living in the countryside is peaceful. On the other hand, it can sometimes feel a bit isolated. Let's look at how we can explain a cause or result. These markers explain why something happens or what the result is. Because is the most natural way to explain a reason. For example, I enjoy studying in the morning because I feel more energetic and focused. So is also a really common way to show a result or outcome. For example, I had a lot of work to finish, so I stayed up late last night. That's why can be used to explain the reason for a previous statement. Like, public transportation is often crowded during rush hour. That's why many people prefer to drive their own cars. Now, how about giving examples? These markers help you develop your ideas with specific examples, which is essential for higher band answers. Of course, we have for example. It's very common and clear when introducing an example. For example, I enjoy outdoor activities. For example, I often go hiking or cycling on weekends. We can also use for instance. It's similar to for example, but slightly less formal. For example, many people use technology for entertainment. For instance, they watch movies or play games online. Finally, we have in fact. It's used to emphasize or clarify a point. I enjoy reading historical books. In fact, I recently finished a biography about a famous leader. Our last category is organizing ideas. And these markers help you structure longer answers and are especially helpful in Part 2 and Part 3 of the test. First of all is used to introduce the first idea or main point. Like, first of all, I usually check my emails when I start my workday. Then is used to show the next step or idea. I clean up after finishing my work. Then I usually relax by watching a movie or listening to music. We can also use after that to show a sequence or order. For example, I like to get up early and after that make a cup of coffee to enjoy in the quiet. Finally is used to signal the last point or conclusion. Finally, I like to spend some time reading before going to bed. What's the key takeaway here? It's that you don't need a lot of complicated vocabulary to sound very fluent. If you can use a few of these very simple discourse markers naturally and flexibly, your answers will already be much clearer and easier to follow, and you'll sound much more natural. Aim for being able to use about 15 to 20 discourse markers naturally, and your score will thank you. Before we continue, if you're finding value in this video, give me a like and a subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps get my videos to more people. Now, let's do an example of how answers can change with the right discourse markers. Let's look at a Part 1 question. What do you do in your free time? Here's a Band 6 answer. I like to read. I read fiction books. I really like Harry Potter. And a Band 7 answer using markers. Well, I really like to read. To be honest, I like to read fiction books or books for kids. For example, I really like Harry Potter. These two answers use almost the exact same language, except that I've added discourse markers in the second answer. They make all the difference in the world. How about this Part 3 question? Do you think technology has improved communication? Our Band 6 answer. I think technology has improved communication in many ways. People can send messages or make video calls very quickly now. This makes it much easier for people to stay in contact with friends or family members who live far away. Many people now use messaging apps to talk to relatives in other countries. A Band 7 answer using markers. Well, I think technology has improved communication in many ways. First of all, people can send messages or make video calls very quickly now. And because of this, it's much easier for people to stay in contact with friends or family members who live far away. For example, many people now use messaging apps to talk to relatives in other countries. However, some people argue that technology can reduce face-to-face communication. See the difference? Now it's time for you to practice. Here's your question. What do you usually do on weekends? Try answering using at least 3 discourse markers, such as well, for example, and also. Leave your answer in the comments below, and I'll give you feedback. Discourse markers are something that you can absolutely learn to use effectively, but you must practice. And remember, it doesn't take many to really level up your fluency and coherence. Remember, if you want help assessing your IELTS speaking, comment free for my free IELTS speaking checklist. Also, all of my classes are now open, so to study with me, click on the link above or in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy studies.